Welcome to Doing Divorce Different. I'm your host, Lisa Koski, and I am excited to have our favorite marriage and family therapist, Brian Burns, back with us today. And today we're going to talk about grief and divorce. And I think, Brian, you're going to educate me a lot because I want to talk about just grief in general a little bit. And
Sure.
then, how it relates to divorce and, how maybe the death of a spouse is maybe the same or different, than getting divorced. So, and then maybe to get some coping mechanisms for people so that they're able to work through it. So, welcome, Brian. You're not like a super uplifting, but a very helpful topic, I think, today.
Yeah. Well, thanks, Lisa. It's good to be here. And yeah, most of my days are not filled with uplifting conversations. Um, so this is comfortable territory
Okay, good.
for me.
Well, do you want to just start out by kind of defining grief and how it works just in general?
Um, sure. So grief is what the body experiences when it experiences loss, when something dear and important is lost. And so lots of writing and research has gone into grief, the most famous being from Elizabeth Kubler-Ross from the, gosh, I think it was probably 80s, but it could have been even before that. And she talked about grief stages: um, denial, bargaining, anger, depression, acceptance. I think in that order. But what people don't know, interestingly, is that was those stages in her research and writing were only applicable to um, terminal patients.
Really?
Who were themselves grieving the loss of their own life. But in pop culture, we've applied it to everything, uh, and there is a lot of applicable information. But that's interesting that those 5 stages are uniquely um, experienced and visible in terminal patients, but not as clear and by the general public
That
experiencing
is,
different kinds of losses.
I love this. I love learning these new
Yeah,
little facts because it just makes me geek out. I
yeah,
had
that
no
is
idea. I had no idea. But will you tell me again? Denial, bargaining.
Oh, sure. Denial, bargaining, anger, sadness or depression, and acceptance.
Okay. And
Tho- Those are those are the 5 stages, and I can talk about each one if that feels useful to you. Um, but what I want to say first is that a more realistic and updated model for grief now is that grief doesn't happen in a linear fashion. You don't start with bargaining and move through those stages
Mhm.
and then get to acceptance and then you're good. It's grief happens in a more circular model where it's very normal to be in denial, which is a healthy way that the body prepares itself to face really hard things. You can't automatically just do that when they're thrust upon you. It's normal to experience bargaining or just this sense of what in the hell can I do to get out of this situation? And I think that's especially relevant to divorce.
Mhm.
If that's not something you're asking for or feel right about, it makes sense to feel anger, like what the F? This is not
Mhm.
fair and not right. This is not what I signed up for. Whether it's the death of a spouse or the death of a marriage or the loss of a job that you value.
Right.
It makes sense to be sad when your body finally kind of comes into the sense of, I guess I got to do this. Um, and it makes sense. And so acceptance, I can't even remember the word that's better than that right now, but acceptance implies that you've accepted that it's okay. And I think what we know about grief is that most losses it's really not okay. Like when someone dies that you
Right.
love, that never becomes okay. That they're gone. You always miss them, and there's a hole in your life that's never filled, nor should it be. And when you lose a marriage that was important to you, that never is okay. That's never the way it was supposed to be. But it is what happened. So acceptance means your ability to tolerate or manage or shoulder the new reality and still have a meaningful, happy, purpose, driven
Mhm.
life.
Very
Uh,
much like a death of a family
yeah,
member. And
yeah,
I like how you just described each of these because it was gentle and it was full of like self-love. Like, yeah, that's okay. That's how
yeah,
because I can tend to be someone that will, why am I feeling like this? And so I love that just being accepting of, well, yeah, that makes sense. That's how you're going to feel.
yeah. Well, you and I were talking before we started recording about what it feels like in your body when you drop your last kid off at school to
Mhm.
college, and that is a feeling of grief. And it's interesting. I recently have gone through that a couple of weeks ago, and we have 4 children. And when we sent the first one off, I was probably in a sense of mourning or melancholy for 2 or 3 months. I didn't tell you this when we were talking
No,
before.
you didn't.
And in looking back, this was, I think, 5 years ago now. It's hard to remember for sure, but my memory is that I was pretty hard on myself. I interpreted that experience of grief um, as sort of guilt or self
Mhm.
recrimination. Like I had not been the father that I had wanted to be to my oldest daughter. And so I interpreted, but that was my interpretation of the feeling. And so I was pretty hard on myself. Now the feeling eventually passed, but it wasn't without kind of a lot of internal struggle. So when we dropped the twins off last or 3 weeks ago, when we got home, I had that same feeling in my body. It's melancholy. It's like you're kind of walking in a fog.
Mhm.
It's feels sad and lonely. But I even sort of without, I think, thinking very hard, I didn't interpret it as I was a failure as a dad. I interpret it as you just dropped your kids off at college, like, of course that sucks. It's
Right.
also awesome, and now that I've
Right.
had practice at it, like I can see the upside. Um, but that I just think that concept of accepting what is happening in your body without labeling it or deciding it needs to be fixed is, well, now we're moving to coping strategies. Um, an essential part of understanding grief. There's nothing you can do to get out of the way of of a loss, that comes into your life. You just get through it. What's the book? You can't go over it. You can't go under it. You can't go
Right.
around it. You can only got to go through it.
And as you say that, it sounds like an opportunity in a weird way. Because I know myself, I can like stuff feelings, right? Many
Yeah.
feelings, I try to stuff them.
Yeah.
And of course, no, you can't. They pop up. But with grief, I feel like it's different because it's so much pain. And like you just said, you can't get away from it and you have to walk through it. And I think I had someone on this podcast one time that said, it's your feelings are kind of like a crying baby. Like you need to hold them and pick them
Yeah.
up and just kind of set them
Self-compassion.
down.
Yeah. Yeah. That's
I
right.
I like that. But now, so Brian, so we think about, so because we're talking about divorce, but like we said, this can apply to anyone. How do people cope with it? So the first thing is you just accept it and love yourself and just be like, it's okay that I feel this way. I'm not going to judge it. So I kind of feel like That's step number one to cope. Maybe, and then maybe they're not in order, but what are
Sure.
some other things?
Well, I would first say about that there's a term in the field or in psychology, uh, complicated grief. And so complicated grief is different than non-complicated grief in that there's aspects of the loss that are harder to understand or cope with. So
Okay.
if
Can I ask, so this is kind of, I was going to ask you about this, and in layman's terms, I remember hearing one time many years ago how it's almost more painful for someone who's been through a divorce than
yes,
for someone who has lost a spouse to death.
yes.
Is that what you're getting
That,
at here?
yeah, that's
Okay.
exactly where I'm going. Is
Okay.
that if it makes sense, if your 89-year-old grandmother dies after being in a memory care unit, that makes sense. That is still grief, but a very straightforward, pretty black and white grief.
Hmm.
That's very different than I'll go to the other extreme, like your 16-year-old dies by suicide and there was no explanation, no way to understand what was happening. Uh,
Ooh, yep.
shouldn't happen, doesn't make sense, no way to really process that as kind of fitting into a scheme of a life, like that's just so far out of what we can understand. So that's
I'm
complicated grief.
I'm
Much
so glad
harder.
we're talking. Yeah, I'm so glad because as you're talking about this too, in my own world, I have a son-in-law who lost his beautiful mom to breast cancer when he was 16.
Mhm.
It's been over 10 years and I don't even know, it still hurts. And he's got, he's getting lots of help, but it's so complicated to me, even like to try
Yeah,
to
it's
understand how he could watch this beautiful woman just deteriorate before his eyes. And so
mm,
that is complicated grief. So
right.
right now, what you're saying about divorce is going to help me with this little issue.
Uh,
Yeah.
divorce is complicated grief, because even if you are in the position of choosing it because you're seeing that the marriage is no longer healthy for you, or for others, anyone, um, it's still, there's still the what ifs. Uh,
Hmm.
there's still that sense of what does this mean about me? Could I have prevented this? Could she, what could my partner have done? Did I choose wrong? Do I have some fatal, error code in my ability to be
Right.
healthy in relationships? That's all complications that makes the grief more intense and heavier and get stuck, actually. We don't want people to get stuck in grief. We want them to experience all of the aspects of it, but continually move through it. And by the way, grief doesn't ever go away. It just, as you move through it, the feelings get less intense. They come around less frequently, and are less impacting or interfere less on the normal day-to-day life. But you always feel, it's
Hmm.
never not sad. So getting stuck means in those stages of anger and sadness, folks often like that's where it gets stuck, where you're kind of overcome with waves of each of those things in unpredictable times. And it's sort of like getting like you jump or are thrown into the ocean actually, and you don't know how to swim. I mean, it's just over.
Hmm.
And so what to do about that, is to kind of get a sense of reality, um, and what is real here. uh, I've never done this before. It is like getting thrown in the ocean,
Hmm.
not knowing how to swim. I don't know how to be divorced because I've never been divorced. So it makes sense to feel fear, to feel frantic, to feel panic. So you're not judging yourself.
Mm-hmm.
What is reality? It makes sense to feel sad, and what are my sad feelings, so that I can differentiate those from anger. Um, so you're doing a review of what are my feelings, sorting out what makes sense and is real, so it's not this big mess of stuckness, of
Mm-hmm.
emotion that kind of comes out in just this, angry, whiny, sort of feeling in your body. And that process slows down just the mental cognitive experience, and you learn about yourself, you learn about what's true, you learn to it, and that helps you move towards acceptance by just knowing. I
Okay.
don't know if this is too kind of.
No, I like this because I'm just thinking through it, and it's kind of what I've learned through coaching too, and what I've experienced because I've had some anxiety, is that when I just, like, if I wake up in the middle of the night and I'm anxious and I just sit and I feel
Yeah,
it and I'm
yeah,
not afraid of it and I don't run from it, that alone has a huge change. So I mean, I often have to write things down. That helps me a lot. And I'm thinking of maybe if you're dealing with these and you're going through a divorce, or like my son in law, maybe just sitting and writing down your feelings so that you can actually name them. I actually have a feelings wheel
yeah, yeah,
that
good. I call
that
it
helps me
feel.
so that, yeah, I can understand what it really is.
So good for you. And that's particularly useful for men. Men should all have a feelings wheel in their desk and in their car and by their bedside table. Because men are conditioned to feel two things, which are fine and angry.
Yeah.
And fine is not a feeling, by the way. So it's only one. They only get credit for one. Um, so yes, identifying the feelings and
Okay.
accepting them is just part of taking control of your life. So that's I want to encompass kind of my comments about coping skill is you have to take control of your life. Like life has kicked you in the ass, and um no, nobody should dispute that. Uh,
Right.
but life kicks everybody in the ass,
Mhm.
sooner or later. Rain falls on every life at some point.
Mhm.
And so this is an opportunity, and you may hate hearing that word,
I
uh,
know.
listeners, depending on the point or the phase that they're in. But when life kicks you in the ass, that's a chance to take the exit that you choose, to take control in a way that leads you to a life of more meaning, more knowledge, more experience that is just as happy and fulfilling as the one that you lost or that was taken from you.
Mhm.
And so taking charge of your life means that you decide the answers to questions like, who am I? What's important to me? What can I control? Uh, who do I want to be 10 years from now? What is this, who am I as a parent? As
Mhm.
a, and if you don't know the answer to those questions, that's fine. But take charge of finding out the answers, of deciding the answers.
Mhm.
Because when you have answers to those questions, it's you have resilience. You can handle what life's thrown at you, even though it's not fun, and
Right.
not your fault, but you can handle it. I was listening to your podcast, some recent episodes, and I think when you take charge of your life, then you choose to do some of the coping strategies that one of your guests was talking through, Dr. Woods, maybe
Yeah.
his
Mhm.
name. That you're uh, making sure that you have a therapist, and I'll come back to that one actually. But sleep, diet,
Yep.
attitude, you know, social connections and supports, like those are just day-to-day things that you can do when you take control of your life to process grief. And I know this is sort of a silly example, like dropping your kid off at college, but
No.
it's fresh in my mind, so I'm using it. That
Yeah.
when I'm walking around in a fog, um, I can still day to day, I can still choose to go to bed at a decent time. I can
Yes.
choose to not drink to numb the
Right.
feelings. I can choose to eat, not eat fast food, but cook at home,
Mhm.
even though I was sorely tempted to just stop at Wendy's, like right on my way home from work. Like those are things, and of course, yes, in 4 or 5 days, the feelings had passed, and I was sort of my normal self, experiencing myself again.
Mhm.
But you can choose to do those day-to-day things, and that is taking charge of your life, and that helps your body move through the emotions of grief
So
more
good.
quickly than not get stuck.
Yep.
If you've
Okay.
if you've been, if you've kind of been in the same place of distressing feelings and it's been 2 or 3 months, I think you might be stuck. Um, I mean, there's no time frame, right? I'm not saying, you know, plan on
Right.
being fine in 2 months. I'm saying if you're not experiencing movement and shifting in your body, that you're in the same place 2 or 3 months down the road, then you might be stuck, and you probably should consider talking to a therapist. If you have, are you familiar with the term ACEs? ACE, Adverse Childhood Experiences.
Mm-mm.
If you have a high ACEs score, meaning, um, so if there's adverse meaning stressful, uh, the ACEs test assigns a point to each adverse child experience. So
Mhm.
divorce, loss of a parent,
Yep.
moving, childhood, like bullying, like these are each stressful experience. So if you have a high ACEs score, if there was trauma in your childhood, then probably that's automatically your ACEs score is going to be really high. You're a good candidate to get stuck in grief, not
Mhm.
of your own fault, but be cognizant of that and get help, because there is good help, and therapy works.
That talk therapy.
Yes.
And, that's what Dr. Woods was talking about too.
Yes.
So then, okay, so basically, when you're stuck, get a good therapist. What should this? So it's hard to find a good therapist for some people, Brian. What are you looking for when
It's
you're?
so hard. I had this conversation twice today already, because it's so hard. I have a
Mhm.
lot of compassion for people that are wanting a therapist, but just making calls and inquiries and not finding, availability. So it is
Mhm.
hard. But a good place to start, well, there's a couple places. Online, the best resource is Psychology Today.
Okay.
That's a magazine, but they have a website and a therapist, what's the term? Database directory,
Okay.
that is probably the most comprehensive out there, at least in this Minneapolis, St. Paul area that we're in, but I suspect it's also nationwide. I just haven't used it for other areas. But and of course, asking your physician, your friend, girlfriend, boyfriends, uh,
Mhm.
those are great resources. And then just cast the net. Reach out to folks, find out what their waiting list is, tell them you're willing to take a last minute, opening, because as a therapist, if someone cancels a day ahead of time and I have 2 or 3 names of people I can reach out who would take it, that works. Like there's often not a week that goes by that that doesn't work out for somebody, and for
Okay.
me, because I fill my time.
Right. And I feel like there's a lot more, kind of a lot more availability with all the virtual.
If you're
Um,
willing to do virtual only, that expands your options by quite a few numbers of magnitude. And the Psychology Today database, you can filter for grief, divorce, trauma informed therapies. So it's a really handy tool.
that's good to know. Okay. So if you're stuck, find a good therapist who is probably going to give you some coping mechanisms. Is that true? I mean, is that,
Well, that's what people, I would probably take issue with the way Dr. Woods described, good therapy, honestly, but I guess I don't disagree with it, but I think it was limited. Some people benefit from tools, like tell me what to
yeah,
do, give me
yeah.
homework, and that makes a big difference. But in my experience, more often the case is that people think that's what they want. And it's, not wrong. Like you should have some ideas and
Hmm.
concrete strategies. But the power of therapy is being known, is being able to be known and seen by someone who's trained to do that well, and then give you a picture of yourself that's much healthier, much more resilient, much better able to process what you're going through. Um, and you can't be known unless you talk and open up and share, which is hard. Like there's
Right.
like you've spent years not being known by your spouse, frankly. I'm
Right.
guessing there wouldn't be a divorce, and you contributed to that. So there's something very healing about being known by someone who's trained to do it well in a healing way.
Well, and Brian, I think what hit me is it probably brings you to that place of acceptance because you have a trained person that you've shared everything with who is looking at it in a healthy way, which it
Right.
would be so comforting to know that, well, yeah, that's how you would cope with this. And so, and I feel like that is just a huge part of the healing process.
Yeah. Yeah. 100%.
Yep. Okay. So, Brian, we are like getting here to the end. I can't believe it. I feel like I could just talk on and on and on with you. This is such a great subject. I feel like we've given people just some peace about how they're feeling, a step they can take before we sign off. And people, where can they find you, Brian, when we do sign off? What is
My website, www.mnrelationshiprepair.com.
Yep, and we always have that in our show notes. Is there any other little piece of advice that you want to leave the listeners with, or have we kind of covered it all?
I'm sure we haven't, but I can't think of anything off the top of my
Okay,
head.
well, good. And listeners know that Brian comes back periodically. So if there are questions, you can always email them to me, and it would be leave us
Yeah,
open to discuss in the future too.
I think that'd be fascinating to kind of have an interactive element and to have questions from your listeners. That would
I
be a lot
think
of fun.
that would be awesome. So we'll be looking for those. So Brian, again, thank you so much. I appreciate that you take the time to do this. It means the world to me, and it helps me as a person, as a mediator, and the listeners out there. So thank you so much for being here today.
You're very welcome. Great to be here.